My name is Philip Bane. I'm the Managing Director of Smart Cities Council, which is a global organization that teaches cities how to be livable, sustainable, and workable, what most people around the world call smart. We're funded by industry, so we have about over 100 commercial members. And I will introduce my panel in a second, but the first question I had is, who are you? How many people in the room are working at the U.S. economic development level or an agency or whatever else? How many people in the room? Anybody? Okay, 2 or 3. How many people are representing entities outside the United States? Ah, the majority. Okay, so that's really interesting. And of those outside the United States, are you commercial interests? Just raise your hands if you are. Okay. Any government interests? Any government agencies? 2 or 3. Okay. So the way I'm reading this is mostly actually a good softball crowd for us, in the sense that all of you are interested in investing in the United States, and we have some experts here who can tell you about that. To my immediate left is Andel Walker, who works for What Works for Cities, and I'll let her explain what she does. Kathy Snorrason, did I get it right?
Kathryn.
Yes. Kathryn, okay. Who works for PlanetM, which is an economic development agency or nonprofit?
It's part of the Michigan Economic Development Corporation.
Okay, in Michigan. And then Bob Bennett, who was the Chief Information Officer for the city of Kansas City. Mm-hmm. And now is a private citizen, but has a lot of stories to tell. So starting with Andel, why don't you give a brief overview of what you do, how it relates to cities, and then since most of the audience is from outside the United States, what would a perspective be about how they could work with you or how they could take your insights with cities in terms of their planning?
Sure. Hi, so I'm Andel Koester with What Works Cities. What Works Cities is an initiative funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies. Bloomberg Philanthropies is the foundation of former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Our mission is to work with U.S. cities to improve their ability to use data and evidence. So we work with over 100 cities all over the country. Any city with a population size over 30,000 is eligible to work with us, so that we typically work with cities around 100,000 to 1 million, but we are also working with some of the larger cities. And what we do is we train city staff in the various practices and policies and skills they need to use data effectively, which is obviously very tied to their ability to use technology to solve problems like homelessness, stormwater management, transportation, you name it. We've probably worked on it. But I think every city is very different. Every city deals with issues that are very different, but a lot of the underlying challenges and opportunities are the same, which is that cities are interested in being innovative. There's a real sort of sea change in city leadership. They're interested in doing things differently. They're interested in partnering with the private sector. But they really need private sector partners who understand the major issues that they're trying to tackle and who have that sensibility about how complex issues like stormwater management and homelessness and affordable housing are. And so for investors and entities who are interested in partnering with cities, having that understanding and that ability to work with cities for the long term is really important.
Now, Andel, on your website, last time I looked, I think you had 10, but I think you have more now. Is it 15 cities that are certified? 13. 13, okay. Mm-hmm. And why would that be important to our audience in terms of them looking for business? It does say something about those cities.
Yeah, it's a great question. In 2017, we launched What Works Cities certification, which is, if you're familiar with LEED certification for green building standards, it's a little bit like that. So we are recognizing and rewarding the cities that we think are best at using data. We think their ability to use data to make decisions and to manage their services makes them emblematic of a well-managed and efficient and effective government. So we, in April, announced a new crop of certified cities. So we're now up to 13 certified cities all over the country. However, we have many cities that are making significant progress towards certification, and we believe that certification provides a roadmap for improvement. And so the cities who are certified are doing particularly well, but they're not the only ones, and there are a lot of cities who are making measurable progress.
So the certification is almost a predicate, I think, in some ways, for a city becoming smart. Would you, I mean, it's not an absolute.
Yeah, we view these data and evidence practices as really foundational and really critical for a city to be able to succeed in using smart technology.
Cool, okay. So I do invite you to go to, why don't you tell them what the website is?
It's whatworkscities.bloomberg.org.
And I'm serious about looking at the cities, because if you're planning business, knowing that a city has already gone through this process, which is pretty extensive to get certified, it means that they've looked at their underlying policies, they understand what they're trying to do, and it certainly would be a leg up in terms of if I was trying to choose where to do business. But Kathryn's going to tell me that where I need to do business is Michigan. So
one step ahead of me.
So why don't we take a little bit of what Andel was saying, and also what you're doing in Michigan, and why that would be important for anybody looking from the outside.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kathryn Snorrason. I'm the Director of Strategic Accounts for an organization called PlanetM. Kind of sounds like a superhero, but the M stands for Michigan and Mobility. So it's an initiative of the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. And just a quick background, because it's a pretty unique program that not a lot of states have. It was started in 2016 as a brand campaign for the state of Michigan, because when I say Michigan, a lot of you might think of automotive or advanced manufacturing, which you would be right. We have 18 OEMs in the state, 96 of the top 100 suppliers, 72% of the R&D that happens in the automotive space in the U.S. happens in Michigan, and the greatest concentration of automotive engineers. So you would absolutely be correct, but we see those as really building blocks to position Michigan as a global hub for mobility and a focus on transportation for the future. So it all started as a branding campaign, but what we're really here to discuss is how that evolved into a business development platform and a support for smart city pilots. And so you'll hear a lot of the examples that I give today have a focus on public and private partnerships, along with philanthropic partners as well. Because as a group, we've been around for about 2 years as a business development platform, and we're proud to say that by the end of 2019, we will have launched 37 pilots across the state of Michigan, and a lot of that is because a lot of collaborative partners came to the table. We aligned on goals and really focused on smart city pilots that are focused on safety, access, and efficiency across the state of Michigan in both urban and rural locations. So you'll hear a lot about pilots today, and also how, having an organization like PlanetM to kind of be the first mover and putting investment into a pilot can really drive additional investment and drive those collaborators to the table. When we say, we'll be the first ones to put funds into something like this that really benefits our residents across the state, you see a lot of people, raise their hands, say, that's something I want to collaborate around. So I'm happy to be here. And
so Kathryn, just like I did with Andel, let's try to go a little bit deeper into this, in the sense that, so you've had 37 pilots. Have you had any participation from non-US companies in those pilots?
Yeah, a lot of, in the automotive space, a lot of those companies are, headquartered abroad. They have a large presence in Michigan. So you'll see, we work very closely with Denso and Bosch and companies like that, who have formulated a US presence over time because they've seen that benefit of collaborating in Michigan. So you'll see some of those come out in the examples.
So for somebody outside the United States who is in the automotive space, obviously looking at Michigan's important.
Yeah.
The other thing to do would be, I guess, if they're part of an automotive ecosystem outside the United States, is to see how that potentially channels or flows into any of the ecosystems in Michigan, correct?
Yeah, yep.
Because you mentioned Bosch. What other,
other global markets
other
do
global,
we touch?
yeah,
absolutely.
other global players.
Yep.
Because that's where it's going to resonate. They're probably already doing business with some of these other big players.
Right. Yeah. So, with saying that, PlanetM is a global mobility hub and Michigan is that global mobility hub, that means we work with other global markets. And so right now we actually have 2 people from our team over in Israel at EcoMotion. So we find markets where there's a lot of activity in the mobility space, and we find partners there, right? So a lot of what we're working on is finding those leading mobility startups in other countries. Israel, Germany, Canada has come up, and we're continuing to grow that platform and bring them to the state of Michigan and see how we can collaborate. And then the larger partners come in as well when they kind of see the leading mobility startups are coming to the table.
So if I'm one of these companies out here and I have an interest in the automotive industry, and so I think therefore Michigan may be a good place for me to come, they would contact you, but should they come to you with an idea of a pilot, or should they come to you? I'm assuming on your website you would have all these 37 pilots with some description, correct?
Yeah, and we can start from scratch, right? So any kind of idea, if you can say, these are the goals that we're trying to accomplish, who else in the state is trying to accomplish something similar? We like to be that provide that table and bring the different collaborative partners together to have that conversation. Because all of our pilots, they didn't start at stage 10, they started at stage 1, right, where there's that initial conversation where nobody knows what it's going to look like, and we want to help lead that and bring the right people to the table.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
So our last speaker today is Bob Bennett, and Bob will introduce himself a little bit, and then I'll go into some questions for Bob. Go ahead, Bob.
So I'm Bob, and I was Chief Innovation Officer in Kansas City, Missouri for the better part of 3.5 years after spending 25 years in the Armed Forces. And during those 3.5 years, sort of the centerpiece of our efforts was a smart city program in Kansas City, which was not a pilot per se. It was more a first phase of an ongoing effort. We learned, quite frankly, through a lot of work we did with Bloomberg for the 7 years prior to my arrival in the city, that number one, data was absolutely the driver of how to make our city smarter. But number two, that there was really only 3 ways to make the city smart when you get right down to it. The first of those was using your electrical distribution system. The second was using your water delivery systems. And the third was your transportation system. Because we quickly figured out that's how you touch every single human being in your community. And if you're not designing a smart city strategy that focuses on everybody, then you're going to get the same small group of wealthy people who get to have the benefits of technology, and the divisions within our society continue to grow. So we used the U.S. Department of Transportation Smart City Challenge in 2016 to kind of build that out and to build a bigger team to come up with our strategy. By about June of that year, we'd figured out a way to take advantage of a streetcar project that we had, and then based on the data that we were collecting on things the city was doing right, and more importantly, the things the city was not quite doing so right, figure out how to start leveraging that data and collecting other pieces which could help us move from just using data to assess performance, but instead help Mayor James start to shape the policies that we were implementing as a city. And so that turned into being able to predict where potholes are going to form, and that changed the way we looked at street maintenance. We used a different algorithm to figure out where crime was likely to occur, so that we could start implementing social programs, primarily education bits and pieces, but also increasing the number of social workers that were established with our police stations in troubled neighborhoods, and increasing that role as opposed to simple policing. And so we did all of that over the course of 2017, focusing initially on those 54 blocks where I had a big hole in the ground, an unlimited ability to put fiber in it for next to nothing, and the ability to bring partners to the table, much like what Michigan's done, in that initial set. So the city provided the dark fiber, which people used for backhaul. Sprint provided the actual fiber network itself, and they brought in about 6 partners with them. Half of them were US-based, half of them were foreign-based. We used Cisco equipment, and they brought in several different partners. And we were able to create an ecosystem where, for about a $25 million project, the city paid about $3.8 million. $1.8 million was in-kind assets, so some of the fiber that we had, forgiving some of our permitting permitting fees. But then we used $1.4 million in cash. And the private sector partners, by investing in the project over a period of 10 years, are going to be generating profit over the life of that project. And so, no, you're not going to be a Silicon Valley millionaire by working in those 54 blocks, but you're going to be able to establish a long-term, slow-burn income rate that you can count on. And for the firms that worked with us, they seemed amenable to it. And after about 3 years, the project seemed to be going pretty well. So we put out an RFP for other people to come in and do for the other 316 square miles of Kansas City what our initial partnership did for the first 2.2.
And why don't you go into a little bit about that? And Bob knew I was going to talk about the RFP, because Bob is a visionary. And Bob had a tremendous vision for Kansas City, still has a tremendous vision for cities in the United States. But he ran into practical issues. He ran into issues that any one of you need to be aware of. And so I've asked Bob if he would be willing to share sort of some of his experiences. And he has a very unique way of sharing them, so I'm sure we'll be laughing one way or the other.
Yes, there will be tap dancing and interpretive dance in a couple of minutes. It'll be great. No, we put out the RFP in June of 2018 with the expectation that we would have responses over about a 90 to 120-day period. Because of the complexity of two components of the RFP, the first of which was a 30-year relationship. Essentially, we were marrying a company. We were not going to be dating, or we were not going to be doing a transaction for a trinket. Any company that walks into a city and brings in a glossy piece of paper highlighting the inherent value of a technology, that conversation will last approximately 30 seconds and you're going to walk away disappointed. If instead someone walks in and says, I read your mayor's State of the City address, I read your city's 5-year business plan, I know what your city manager is looking at in terms of priorities for spending over the next 5 years, this is how a technology that we have developed will help you over that entire lifespan. Getting our corporate partners who responded to that RFP to make that leap and to look at a long-term investment strategy and a long-term relationship play ended up causing us to extend that timeline for the RFP by about 6 months. When that happened, we bumped into the other major obstacle, which was politics. I was a mayoral appointee, which was an incredible opportunity. And as kind as Philip was to say that I had a vision of sorts, there was only one person in Kansas City who was authorized to vision, and his first name was Mayor. Yeah. The rest of us are responsible for implementing that vision. And I had an amazing one. The only issue is he was term limited. And by delaying the submission of the RFPs by a significant period of time, it delayed the ability for my team to still be in place to establish that first tranche of contracts and to get the ball rolling on the implementation phase. And so what occurred was we had to transition the entire RFP selection process over to the city manager side of the house. And so it went from my little office, where everyone is a policy person first, an operator first in general terms, and an engineer in the third sense, to a bunch of folks who are engineers in the first sense. And I love me some engineers. God, I love me some engineers. If I can give an engineer a left and right limit, they can literally amaze and astound and create miracles within those left and right limits. But when you give a public works director an open-ended, ill-defined, and aspirational RFP, the first thing that the public works director does is lose their mind. The second thing they do is fail to make a decision. Because no engineer in their right mind is going to make a decision without 100% of the information available. And in this type of an RFP, that was not possible. And so the politics of all of us being term limited certainly hampered the ability to get that thing done. And if I had it all to do over again, I would probably first have done my little chief innovation role on our procurement process, and then would have gone after the other problem. Right. And I would have broke that first.
So there's some interesting lessons here, and we'll come back to them. But for those that are from outside the United States, one of the things that you've clearly heard from our 3 speakers is we really do not have a top-down planning hierarchy when it comes to urban planning. So, it's not the White House, it's not the Senate, it's not the Congress. Now, if you're from China, if you're from India, if you're from even Australia, and I've done work in all these countries, and especially if you're from Europe, you're very used to a top-down approach, which is the EU puts significant amounts of money out on the Horizon 2020 programs and other programs to, especially around energy efficiency, to affect change in all the constituent countries. And that just doesn't happen in the United States. Most all our cities and all of our states are self-funding all of these opportunities. So you have to understand that they're not only funding at the local level, they're also planning at the local level. So what I want to talk a little bit now, and the first thing I was going to do was ask, based on our short introduction, were there any questions from the audience? Because I really do believe this is a conversation, and I may not choose to answer your question immediately, but I'll fold it into our discussion. But based on what we've already talked about, are there any questions in the audience that we should take into account? Okay, we were good about that. So what I'd like to, yes ma'am, go ahead. Could you maybe use the microphone if you don't mind? Just because it's easier. I have bad hearing.
I heard a number of things about initiatives, but in terms of housing and other things. Do you do anything related to recycling and?
So how would that play in? So if somebody was interested
yeah.
in recycling, great question. And so let me think for a second. Data can play in recycling. There are a lot of startups. Mobility can play in recycling in terms of what it does in terms of swapping out costs and stuff.
Yep.
And then I'm sure you dealt with it too in Kansas City.
Certainly, yeah. Sensors in trash cans, sensors in recycling kit allowed us to be more efficient with those devices.
Okay. Any thoughts from either one of you about that?
Yeah, I mean, data should and often does inform every service that a city delivers. And a lot of our cities are thinking very hard about their waste management in general and their waste collection. In some cases, that is specifically around recycling. It really, it depends on the nature and the specifics of that city, what their challenge is. So it could be maybe they are incredibly geographically distributed, and so they need to think about how to optimize their collection routes. Maybe it's about getting the right contracts with the right recycling providers that meet the city's climate goals or their green goals, to Bob's point about making sure that you understand the city's and the mayor's strategic initiatives. So it plays out in a number of different ways.
Yeah. And I can give a specific example for Detroit. Like Bob was saying, if you're reading a city's reports, Detroit came up with a strategic plan for transportation, and one of the 5 areas of that report is focused on vitality and beauty, right? And part of that also encompasses, the movement of goods, which can include recycling. So if you do dig deep into a city's reports and strategic plans that they have coming out, even in an area where you wouldn't expect recycling necessarily, like transportation, it could come up in those reports, and then you can see how the different strategic plans within a city are connected, and whatever your goals within recycling are could play into that.
I know Charlotte, North Carolina actually has a explicit focus on circular economy and in recycling that Amy Osterker is leading.
Right.
And they're having a big event there in September, I think, to talk specifically about that effort.
So the nature of the question and what I had said earlier, you really do have to look specifically to a state, a city, a region, because they'll all have different issues around this. Some will be more interested in recycling. Some will have state laws that are different, like California. Yeah. And so, it's the same thing with automobiles. They're going to have different types of laws that you need to be aware of. Yeah. So now changing the conversation a little bit, Andel, when you've done this work with cities, where have you seen the biggest interest around your data certification? Like, what is the driving force that's getting the cities to come and talk to you? And where do you provide the most help to them? And the reason I'm asking this is because if we can identify what cities say they need, then that's something that maybe the audience can start figuring out how they address that need.
Yeah. I would say the driving force is that residents don't distinguish between what services are being provided by the city versus the county, the public works department versus the stormwater department, or the transportation or the water utility. And so residents just want their problem solved. They want their trash picked up. They want the police to come when they call. They want the potholes fixed in the road. And so what's really driving our cities and their interest in using data is they are increasingly understanding, and I think in the last 10 or 15 years for the first time have access to technology that makes it possible to think in that resident-centered way. And that means cutting across silos. And that's where we come in, is helping them use data and understand the way data helps them them break out of their departmental boxes and think about, if I'm going to fix a water main break in a road in Syracuse, New York, which is a major problem for a city like Syracuse with aging infrastructure, how do I make sure that the road repair folks have access to that data too? And they can think about what other projects they maybe had in line, and we can do it all at the same time, and we only have to dig up the road once. And some of that is being driven because residents are expecting better, higher quality services because the city is growing, their population is changing. Sometimes it's because the city is struggling and they need to do more with less. But all of those are really compelling reasons for a city to want to get better at using data.
And since you're very much focused on best practices and certification, this is near and dear to anybody who does anything in technology. How does open standards, interoperability, and proprietary technology play in this mix?
Yeah, it's huge. And one of our main areas of work is around open data and talking about data governance and using civic data standards. We don't have a favorite. It's not our role to pick a standard, but there are a number of standards out there that we strongly encourage and train cities on using. And one of the biggest challenges for cities when they work with technology providers is thinking about, can I get the data back out of whatever this tool is? Can I use it to solve other problems? Do I need to depend on the vendor to get the data back out? Are they going to give it to me in a PDF form that I can't use for anything else? And because cities simply don't have the luxury of thinking, again, in these silos and in these very proprietary ways. And they're open to sharing their data. A lot of our cities are making their data public on open data portals. They're making their performance data public. But it really has to be a two-way street. And that's what they're looking for from vendors. Otherwise, it's going to be a very short-lived and very frustrating engagement.
So if you're coming from outside the country, I mean, the EU is very, very good about open standards and interoperability, but there are other markets that not so much. I mean, I've done work out of Singapore in the ASEAN market, and that tends to be more proprietary. So those can be issues for a city then, I think that's what we're saying, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So Kathryn, I talked about AVs, but a lot of your pilots are really about mobility. Mm-hmm. So obviously they're then more than a technology. They involve the sharing economy, the circular economy, inclusiveness that Bob was talking about. Mm-hmm. So how does that, since it's more than technology, what are sort of some of the soft characteristics of these pilots, and how should anybody analyze them if they wanted to participate? Because when I read your list of pilots, it was pretty impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And they are very diverse. So I'll give you an example. One of our challenges that we introduced last year was the $8 million Michigan Mobility Challenge. And this was an aspect of mobility that doesn't immediately come to mind. A lot of us think of safety and efficiency. How can we get from point A to point B? But the governor, Governor Snyder, was thinking about also access, right? So how do we move people, how do we close the mobility gaps for people who are seniors, veterans, and people with disabilities? And that's kind of that softer side of mobility, right? Because mobility is the movement of people and goods, but it's also creating access and opportunity and economic opportunity for people. So with these funds, with $8 million that MDOT brought to the table, we were able to open up a challenge, and it was actually one of the most rewarding days of my career. Not to get too sentimental, but it was fantastic having a workshop where advocacy groups who experience these challenges every single day could come to the table and talk about these are the challenges that our residents are experiencing, whether it's from one of those three groups, veterans, people with disabilities, or seniors. And then you had transportation providers who don't interact with these advocacy groups every day, come to the other side of the table with an open ear, and they really listened to what those advocacy groups had to say. And then from that, they found partnerships after the workshop and were able to actually propose solutions to address those challenges across the state in both urban and rural environments. And so if you look online, we have 13 pilots that are being launched across the state of Michigan to address those challenges. And it really is a way to address a side of mobility that doesn't immediately come to mind, but is a huge focus area and concern for a lot of people.
And in my own experience, I mean, so like if you were a solution provider from Europe, or I know Norway has done a lot of work on aging populations, as has Japan. So this may be an area where you could really bring a solution to the United States that we're not familiar with. And you may even have the data to show that it works. You've been able to work with older populations or different types of populations. Even if you got state funding or whatever, those would be things I think you would find, especially in the larger urban areas here in the United States, there'd be a lot of interest. And that's why I was asking that, because I think that's one of the areas where I think we're really open to ideas.
Right.
Yeah.
And just because I say it's a past challenge doesn't mean that door is closed by any means. We still want to have that conversation. If there are more pilots, more ideas, more collaborations on the table, there's always that possibility for it in the future.
Good. Now, Bob, one of the things you and I have talked about is, and I proverbially call it death by pilot. And Bob was instantly talking about the plane that he came over from Kansas City. But my own experience in working with many commercial solution providers is that there's a real issue around cities want to first engage in a pilot. And the pilot tends to, I have a little bit of an engineering background, tend to be very focused on a particular use case. So they'll be very, we're going to do something around AV, mobility, or energy efficiency for this particular block, and it may not be representative of all the rest of the city. The other issue is obviously the funding of it. Cities, if I ever hear the word living lab again, I think I will literally walk out the door, because so many cities, because everybody's trying to sort of put their feet in the water or their toe without making a big commitment because they're not familiar with it. That's why case studies, work that you've done in other jurisdictions, other parts of the world can be really important. But Bob, maybe you can give your perspective, because I think you've been on both sides of the table, and also this idea of possibly aggregation of demand and iterative development.
Yeah, pilots have had a place. And I think that place has pretty much fulfilled what it needed to do. We know that 5G is viable. We know that because it's live in the heart of Kansas City today. It's live in a couple of other cities right now. We now know what it takes to deploy it in multiple places. And so that testing is complete. We know that a lot of the mobility as a service things that Michigan has done an amazing job, and the stuff y'all are doing up at Ann Arbor is just rock star awesome. The fact that Tampa then took it to the next step tells us that, yeah, the Ann Arbor pilot was awesome, but now we're ready to go to scale. That's the next stop. I mean, there's probably, about 100 of us in the room right now? That means there are about 105 definitions for what a smart city is right now in this room, because we haven't standardized anything yet. And that's generally okay, but it's time for us to move beyond pilots. The reason we set the RFP up the way we did was I needed for someone to come to Kansas City who is not interested in doing something flashy with the expectation that the post-event press conference was the ultimate end. It was more, no, I want to fundamentally change mobility in the city of Kansas City so that a kid who lives in a disadvantaged neighborhood in the farthest north section of the city, which is about 25 miles linearly to where the jobs are, actually has a chance to have multiple ways to get there that don't take an hour and a half. I want to fundamentally change the way that we do water storage and water treatment, because if we did that using technology, we could take a $4.3 billion consent decree and transform it into about a $2.8 billion consent decree, because we could use our existing water infrastructure as storage capacity and not have to build an entirely new water treatment plant for a community that has more cows in it than people, because we have that in Kansas City. So it's time to move beyond the pilots. It's time to operationalize. And that means that the cities have to embrace the corporate sector and say, we know that we can't afford to do this in just out of our own pocket. So we want to partner with you. And in exchange for that, here's access to our city right-of-way. Here is the opportunity for you to gain profit over a long term. And oh, by the way, what we expect out of you is, because your name is on this too, you got some skin in this game. We will have things like life cycle replacement. We will have things like, oh, look, there's a new widget which helps us to do this better. We figure you're going to install that because it saves you money too. And in a performance-based contract, you can do that. But we got to get beyond the pilot.
What about, and you talked a little bit about this, I don't know if you want to share it about, you were talking about your experience in Phoenix about aggregating demand.
IDP, I forget what the acronym stands for.
Institute for Digital Progress.
Those guys.
Those guys.
It's Dominic Papa. He's a rock star. Called Dominic. Essentially what he's done is he's taken the needs of 22 different communities in the Phoenix Metroplex, of which Phoenix is not the largest. In fact, Gilbert is bigger, and Mesa is bigger. And they have created a single place where cities can contribute their ideas to solving problems in their municipality. Dominic then aggregates that need across the other 21 members of this consortium, and now all of a sudden common contracting can take place because the state has embraced what Dominic's doing. Dominic is serving as the common sanity point for all 22 city leaders, and now you have a market of about 7 million people as opposed to just one of the smaller communities, so that the company that can come in, do business with Dominic, can actually have the scale required to actually generate profit while doing business with the city.
And one of the things that, I know Dominic very well, I was with him 2 weeks ago, and one of the things that really works well for Phoenix, and this is something you should look in when you do your strategic sort of review of any community, is its relationship with Arizona State University.
Yeah.
ASU is one of the top technical IoT universities in the country. They've taken their own campus in Mesa and done a lot of different things there with IoT. Chris Richardson, their deputy, I think CIO now, is really another rock star there. And so they have the strong support of that community. And it's that kind of support that you need to be looking for when you're trying to figure out where your investment is going. Andel, have you seen similar types of partnerships that maybe have brought some of your certified cities up? Have there been, what's contributed to their success other than their own internal? So if I'm out there, I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to that city, but I need to see what to know that it's successful?
Yeah, so many ways to answer that question, but I'll start with the partnership side. So a lot of, and this is another way in which U.S. cities are often different from cities around the world, is there are universities in all of these cities with researchers with varying degrees of pretty sophisticated technical expertise. Our highest performing cities are getting really good at leveraging that external expertise. So in my previous life, I worked for IBM in their philanthropy division on their Smarter Cities Challenge, and one of my first projects was also in Syracuse. Syracuse is a great city, and they have a problem with blight, and we helped them develop a predictive model to identify which neighborhoods were at risk of turning so that the city could intervene and make investments before the neighborhood essentially went downhill. It was a great idea. The city at the time didn't really have the analytical capacity because it was a pretty sophisticated model to keep running the model. They used it at the time to get an investment from the state to set up a land bank, so they made good use of it at the time, but they couldn't keep running the model. They have since then set up a partnership with Syracuse University, who can start helping them to update that model. Arlington, Texas, which is one of our newest certified cities, silver certified.
Right outside of Dallas.
Right outside of, yeah, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, one of the bigger cities you haven't heard of. They've formalized a partnership with the University of Texas in Arlington, where they've sort of collaboratively identified data sets that support problems that the city wants to solve. In the case of Arlington, it's around mobility. A lot of data around paratransit. How do you move communities who are not able to drive themselves for various reasons? And leveraging that analytic and research expertise. And we're seeing a lot of other cities use even more advanced research, like AI research, a number of different places. The University of Chicago has a data science for social good program that's doing really great work to help cities do this kind of modeling. So our really successful cities are getting quite savvy about using resources outside of City Hall.
Yeah, I mean, one of the cities that has actually done quite well with its university relationship was Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon.
Right.
They've done a lot of good work too. So looking at a city and looking what its relationship with the local universities is really important in understanding. Kathryn, we've talked about, I told you about my Death of Pilots theme, which with your 37 pilots. So if I'm sitting out in the audience, how are you moving beyond pilots?
Yeah.
Obviously, you don't want to be at 57 pilots and counting. So the question is of the pilots that you're working on, which are going to mature?
Yeah.
What lessons did you learn from them that possibly would lead to more mature projects, and that you would maybe tell us one story of something you wouldn't do again?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one, when PlanetM and MEDC invest in a pilot, we are absolutely looking for a diversity of pilots, because to me, each pilot is kind of like its own startup, right? So you're building something to see if it works, and then you hope to scale it from that point on. So we are really looking for a diversity of pilots, so that way, we hope that some of them go beyond that stage, that they actually can scale across a state, across a region of the U.S., and then eventually across the U.S. So a lot of these companies, when they come to us with a pilot, that's not their end game. They're ultimately looking to build it out in their business model. And so one that was our first pilot, where we've kind of seen it already start to take those next steps, is a Dubai-based mobility startup called DERQ. They have a
How do you spell that?
DERQ.
DERQ.
Yeah. They have a V2I technology, vehicle to infrastructure, and our first partner that we introduced them to was MDOT. So talking about strategic collaborations, absolutely having access
Michigan
to
Department of Transportation.
Exactly. Yep. Having access to the right infrastructure partners, so that they can have access to those intersections where there are the most fatalities. And so introducing this Dubai-based startup to MDOT really gave them success in putting their technology at a very crucial intersection in Detroit, because Detroit, you can actually go south to Canada. So they put their technology right when you come over the border. You're going north from Canada to Detroit. You exit into a huge intersection at Jefferson and Randolph, and there are 6 lanes, so 12 lanes intersecting at that intersection, and they're able to put a technology there to predict pedestrian movement, so that fleets of vehicles going through that intersection can actually get alerts to when a pedestrian might cross the road versus when they're holding back, and their body language is telling the driver, no, I'm not going to cross. So it gives them predictive warnings so that they can avoid fatalities. And from that pilot, they're actually looking to expand that into the city of Ann Arbor. So it really shows that one pilot, one intersection, that's just a starting point. We really want to see these companies come to Michigan and scale it to the next city, the next region, and then eventually across the U.S. and really have a big win.
Now, do tell us, what was the one thing you wouldn't do again?
I was going to say, one thing we wouldn't do again. Man, I mean, I would say the biggest hurdle for a lot of these pilots is they just take a lot of time and patience. So we had a huge project, a huge undertaking. Imagine 10 partners coming to the table, public, private, philanthropic, addressing the mobility needs of Detroit residents. It's been about 18 months, and we're going to see the first launch of a pilot in July. So that is the one thing to keep in mind when you come to the table. You might have an idea, but if there are other partners that you need to collaborate with at the table, the larger that number grows, the larger that timeline grows as well. And the biggest hurdle, there's a lot of turnover, right? So especially in the mobility space, companies are constantly creating new departments, new strategies, new goals, and that means they're changing their organization structure, and your point of contact that you depended on for 6 months is no longer there. So it stretches out the timeline. Ultimately, we have seen success from that specific project in Detroit, but I would say the more you can do to kind of shorten that timeline so you can avoid as much turnover in positions as possible to really move those things forward.
And not to steal your thunder, I live in Virginia, which is just out, and I live outside Dulles Airport. And so we're doing a lot of work with the state of Virginia, Commonwealth of Virginia, great state. But I've spent a lot of time in Michigan, too.
Yeah.
I actually worked in Detroit for a while.
Yeah.
And we face that very issue around pilots. And so what we've done is we're using a tool we provide to actually organize all the stakeholders and get them, because the big problem, I mean, this is a problem even in India, where the civil service in cities only stay for about 3 years, and then they're gone, because they're hired at the state and federal level. And it's a constant problem about how do you develop knowledge in any kind of institution. And that's a huge issue when you have a lot of different stakeholders. But I did a post today on LinkedIn about the fact that cities are probably one of the hardest ecosystems to organize. I think you could talk a little bit about that, Bob, right? I mean, you just did with the political issues. But if you're coming from the outside, I mean, I think in sales terms, like, what's the belly button you push? Where do you go first, right? To maybe have an impact in a city, or you're not going to get access to the mayor, and the mayor may be term limited, and the mayor elected out. So where do you go?
If a company were to want to do business in a smart city type space, Yes, you're going to read about the priorities in the sexy level piece of it in a State of the City address or talking to the mayor. In our city, we had a $1.8 billion annual budget. The mayor had about $400,000 a year discretionary income he could spend. So yeah, don't go there. Go to the city manager's office. That's where the money is. 60-something% of Kansas City's budget goes to public safety. The next big chunk of the budget goes to public works. If it moves or if it is infrastructure, that's where the city has money to spend. And so that's where probably, if you're looking to sell something, that's where you solve a problem and you'll find a very happy ear, because efficiencies in those places allow cities to actually afford to operate. Because the other, funky thing that we don't talk about a lot is that if someone leaves City Hall, someone down in HR gets excited because we just met the goal for shrinking a department, because we don't have to pay someone back. Yeah. We don't have to hire someone back to fill that job. The next person in that department leaves, and that's awesome because now we can afford the pension for both of those people. The third person leaves, now you can hire someone back. And oh, by the way, when you hire that someone back, they're going to expect the technologies that the Bloomberg organization is working really hard to get cities to adopt. Because every single person we're hiring now has a basic expectation that they're going to be working off of a computer screen. There's going to be data on that screen to help sort of shape their understanding of the world around them. It's not just going to be the same 12 people who show up to a city council meeting. Because while those 12 people are fun and interesting, those anecdotes get old really quick. And the data changes a lot faster.
Absolute sense.
Yeah, and if I can tie sort of what you were both talking about, the data can be a really huge tool. I totally agree that you cannot discount the time and the importance of engaging the community and working with the stakeholders in the right way. But the data can be a really powerful way of doing that, because it sort of levels the playing field in terms of your common understanding of the problem. It's a way of, sometimes community organizations have a different perception of the problem. Sometimes it's legitimate. Sometimes they have access to insights and information that the city does not have. But sometimes there's also just a historical perception that the city operates in a particular way, or that communities have certain needs that are simply no longer true. We have some cities like Sioux Falls, South Dakota, whose demographic makeup has shifted dramatically in the last 10 years. So if you're going to talk about a new public works initiative or an affordable housing initiative, you need to start by using data to get everybody on the same page about who your residents really are and what their needs are. And that's an opportunity, but it's a really important challenge that you can't shortcut.
And they just hired an innovation officer last week.
Yep.
Yeah. So before we just open it up for a last set of questions, these are, at least in my sort of view of this, the takeaways. You obviously, if you want to do business in the United States with cities, you have to understand that most cities are making their own decisions about procurement, budgets, the needs of the city. I think Andel was just talking about that, as a matter of fact. The second thing is, I would go to What Works for Cities website and look at which of the jurisdictions or either cities have gotten the certifications or in the process. The reason why? Because you want to find those that are qualified. You want to find the cities that actually are thinking seriously about data. Obviously, we all know we have to go to Michigan one way or the other, but I think the key point in what Kathryn was talking about was the fact that they actually are funding pilots. But maybe the way you have to do this is you have to look at your own ecosystem. If you're in the mobility or AV or transportation space, you want to look at your own ecosystem and figure out how you can leverage that into the Michigan ecosystem. Because if you're part of a partnership, your chances are better of getting that business, of being able to make that work, than if you come in as a lone flyer like Bob was talking about, is if you just come in and say, I've got a great hammer, I'm going to pound all your nails, no problem, but you don't talk about the partnerships you have, the case studies you have, where you've made a difference in other jurisdictions, and possibly how you know what that particular city needs. And that, to me, is the biggest issue, and you were alluding to this, is most of the commercial companies that I deal with don't take the time to figure out what the city really needs. So, any other questions from the audience? Sir.
The American Chamber of Commerce in Iraq.
In Iraq, okay.
And you mentioned something about Dubai. I was wondering, how do you actually build these relationships with other countries? For example,
Yeah.
if another country is seeking your expertise, is there a way to offer services or build partnerships?
Yeah.
Let me repeat the question.
Sure.
The gentleman was from the absolutely fine. American Chamber of Commerce in Iraq. He noticed that PlanetM is doing business with a startup from Dubai, and he wanted to understand a little bit how that relationship developed, how it started, and potentially how he or anybody else could take advantage of a sure.
Sure.
I'm from Dearborn, Michigan.
Oh, fantastic. I grew up
Okay.
in Dearborn.
Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so the Dubai-based mobility startup is a little bit of a unique story, so I'll give it, but then give another example. So that one came to us through Techstars Detroit. So a lot of times we'll work with accelerator or incubator programs in Michigan, and as those startups are coming to the state, we find a way to engage them. So that one came through an existing program. But a lot of times PlanetM is looking for accelerators in other countries. Like in Israel, we work with Drive, and they specifically work in Israel to identify the leading mobility startups. So we love engaging them because they know who's leading in their country and which startups are really ready, to come to Michigan and to work in our ecosystem and find those partnerships. But I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards, and always open for that conversation and building new partnerships.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, well, thank you for your, sir, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Roy. And the question I have is, I grew up in India. I know about the Indian part of the smart cities, which nothing but, hanging bunch of Wi-Fi to make it available for the cities at this point of time. I worked in IBM in the Smarter Planet area. I'm a UMKC graduate, and, I lived in Tampa and worked for Verizon. So during my tenure with Ericsson as a vendor, I was part of working with a series of smart city initiatives across globe. You talk about Dubai District 3 or IBB in Turkey, Hong Kong Smart City Initiatives, or in Panama. Everywhere, the problem we faced from the vendor side is there is no one vision in the administrative which we can interact with to have a clear-cut idea. In this global scenario, I have not worked in any of the US city administrations yet on that. So is that different in this state in the US where there is one plan or vision by state? I understand it, and the states don't have to be same. It can be different, but even within that state, the cities, do they have one strategic plan which is for the smart city, how they want to see their smart city?
Great. Bob? Yeah.
No.
I do, yeah.
But I will tell you that there are certain characteristics that I think make this an incredibly exciting time to be in this industry. Because if, especially using a Bloomberg methodology, we could come up with some standardized measures of performance that all cities share. Mobility in terms of number of people on your public transportation systems. Congestion in terms of road, but also some of your freight operations. Some of your greenhouse gas emissions, where there's already a C40 standard. Some of your housing issues, if you want to look at almost a Big Mac index like The Economist does. If a large company could come up with a conglomerated set of tools that address those things that all cities have to get to, that would be awesome. Because quite frankly, that could be replicated, sold to multiple cities, and it could sit over here. But don't ask that tool to solve a city's policy problems. Because what that can do then is if you solve the replicable problems for all cities, and you just focus on those, a city is going to use its own ecosystem to develop a data analytics firm to help get to that policy level. So it's going to encourage some partnerships. It's going to help you find some new partners in crime as you move forward with that. And it allows you to focus on those things that are common. And a great way to get engaged with that, and I'll give Philip a little bit of a plug here. The council does a great Smart Cities event here in DC every October. Harvard has a group where they actually get about 20 smart city leaders together semi-annually. that David Ricketts runs. Cities Today has a group called the 2020 Cities Forum, which actually has 4 events per year, 2 in the US, 2 in Europe, so you get an international flavor for that. And you actually get the perspectives of 20 cities at a time to what their shared problems are. You solve for those shared problems in those forums, you're on to something.
There's a lot of, I think the point being is there's a lot of different entry points. We've talked about universities, nonprofits. We've talked about economic development organizations like PlanetM, and of course there's a whole bunch of them here for you to meet. We've talked about the cities themselves. But remember, the aspect of the technology that we're talking about, since it's generally about IoT, it works in universities, it works in military bases, it works in hospitals. It works in any kind of community where you have human beings and human needs. So given the fact the size of our economy, the relative growth, and the fact that our infrastructure is degrading, there are huge opportunities in this country for anybody who wants to make infrastructure or cities smart. So with that, thank you for your time and look forward to talking to you.